Thank you. This is going to be quite a theoretical lecture. Well, in my opinion, much broader than the question of the contemporary revolutions, and not just about Ukraine, but indeed about post-Soviet politics and the post-Soviet politics in the current context. So, I'm going to talk first about the crisis of knowledge, I think, which is happening now and is probably intensifying. I'm going to talk about the research program that is focused on crisis of hegemony and counter-hegemony, their connection. I'll talk about a way that we can look at the post-Soviet authoritarianism based on Gramsci's theory, about the contemporary revolutions that do not change social structure or the state structure, but they do produce significant outcomes that should be theorized, should be understood. And they are happening and happening more and more. Just recently, there was a failed attempt in Iran, and there probably will be more. And in the end, I'll talk about Ukraine's Euromaidan based on my writings and findings and like years of empirical research, and finally about conclusions. So what I mean about the crisis of knowledge. So there is kind of like something like a zeitgeist of the crisis. And each year we get this meme online. The future is scary and unknown. And the year of 2026 has just started and it has not disappointed us already. And it looks like there will be even more like this. And by the end of the year, not sure what we are going to get in that picture, probably something worse. Or at least if this meme works, it kind of like points to a certain reality, right? A number of people are feeling that something that is going on is going to be worse than we had before, and what is even worse, that we do not even understand what is coming next. The events that are coming this year, next year, next year, next year are truly unimaginable for many, many people. And for those people who could predict them, there were like systematic forces that made them silent, or at least less heard. And this points to the crisis of knowledge. There is something problematic with the ways how we perceive the society and the whole world, that we actually do not understand what is going to happen next. And the developments about the Russia-Ukraine war actually exemplified, manifested this crisis of knowledge, perhaps in a very evident way. So there have been many people who have been professional observers, military analysts, political scientists, social scientists. Many of them were consistently wrong on the developments of this war. And it doesn't mean that there were no people who actually did have a proper prediction on what is going to happen, that the war is going to happen, that how it's going to develop, not in the way that, Ukraine may be victorious. But again, there were systematic forces, institutional, but also in the knowledge structures that made them less visible, more silent. So these are the headlines of the discussions. Up to 2024, there was still discussing why so many experts didn't predict the Russian invasion of Ukraine. By this year, there are like many people who are still insisting Russia is losing the war. And these are the headlines of of not just like some opinion writers, but of the experts in the think tanks working on the security, on the military issues, and they insist by December 2025, Russia is losing. And probably at this point, there is a certain need to reassess kind of like the systematic failures, the systematic push to overestimate Ukraine's resilience. And that also connects to the research which is conducting in that direction. So if we are interested primarily in Ukraine's resilience, we are looking into very specific issues, how the people volunteer, how they create initiatives, how they resist the worse and worse conditions of living in the Ukrainian cities. But at the same time, if you're focused on this, we are systematically underestimating the draft dodging, the desertion, AWOLs, and we actually do not process the concepts and frameworks to understand probably the crucial factor leading to the likely outcome of this war. Why so many Ukrainian males do not want to fight for the state. At the same time, well, different topic of research, focusing on the looming crisis of Russia. Russia is weak. Russian economy will just collapse under the force of sanctions. That was like a very strong opinion in 2022 and 2023, at least until up to this moment. Because of course they need a legitimation to introduce more and more sanctions, and they need to kind of to show that it's supposed to work, right? And this kind of like structures the way where they look for. What kind of like evidence they look for, how they interpret that evidence, right? So it's still the expectation of the eventual Russian collapse, or the splits within the Russian elites. When exactly those Russian oligarchs are supposed to organize against Putin? And then if we are focusing on this, we are starting to miss that probably a big number of the Russian ruling elite and of the Russian ruling class may actually be consolidated as a result of this war and may actually start to benefit as an outcome of this war. Or the studies of the Russian society that Russians are, well, probably do not support the war enthusiastically, and at this moment they may support peace and so on and so forth, but at the same time you may miss to understand why so many Russians still enroll into the Russian army. And this is not just about money, because the same ways to attract Ukrainian males into the Ukrainian army by offering high rewards actually do not work. But for certain reasons they work in Russia. And that may point to some capacity of institutional mobilization, so on and so forth. Or the misunderstanding of the global change, when our focus is on the Western unity that is supposed to defend Ukraine, protect Ukraine, and mobilize in support of Ukraine. And then it starts to fracture. And then a number of people are just in a total surprise what Trump is doing. But again, this points to our crisis of knowledge. Why so many people, or at least certain institutional knowledge forces, they were pushing this opinion into the forefront while silencing the critical questions that might have pointed to the developments which are unfolding right now. And what is happening right now, I think, in the looming outcome of the war is a crisis of the main research paradigms about the post-Soviet transformation in general, what has been happening in our part of the world since 1991 or even earlier. And the research programs which actually define our basic assumptions, define our main questions that we want to study, define the kind of evidence that we collect, define how we interpret that evidence. So if you look at the post-Soviet transformation as democratization, right, it's just kind of like looks less and less appropriate at all. Looking at the dynamics of Russia, of Belarus, of most of the Central Asian countries, the developments in the Caucasus, and so on and so forth, and also in Ukraine itself, which was supposed to be like the strongest democratic country, at least if we do not count the Baltic states that have been incorporated into the EU quite earlier. And developments with the Ukrainian political regime, which have been like pushed forward just last year with the corruption conflicts and so on and so forth. Or we just do not see this, or at least we are focused on different things, and we lack the concepts to understand these developments if you work in this research program. Or decolonization, again, has become especially prominent with the failure of the Russian original invasion plan in 2022. The Ukrainians were decolonizing, abandoning the Soviet and Russian past, and this was supposed to happen not just in Ukraine. There have been quite many people who would like to push to reinterpret the whole post-Soviet period as a decolonizing process. So it's not just about Ukraine, it's how about the Central Asian countries are becoming more independent and kind of like autonomous from Russia, not really relying on them so far, and also in developing sort of nationalist policies, or what is happening in Armenia in particular, or after their defeat in the war with Azerbaijan, and also less reliance on Russia. But at the same time, we start to forget what happens in Georgia and how the Georgian oligarchs are becoming more pragmatically aligned with Russia. We forget about Belarus. We forget about, actually different developments in Central Asia when they actually need Russia. And we also forget about what is happening in Ukraine itself and the backlash against ethno-nationalist decolonization. And then, a different research program, patronal politics, which has actually become a mainstream in the political science working on the post-Soviet countries. The elites organized into something like mafia groups, which twist, use the formal institutions in their own interests, but the actual politics is structured by the informal connections, informal interests, informal groups, and this produces a kind of deficient politics, bad governance, when the state is serving very specific particular interests of very narrow circles. For example, connected to Putin's cronies or to Lukashenko personally, and so on and so forth. And this creates a cycles of patronal politics, where the personal leaders could be replaced, but this doesn't basically change the very structure of the informal authoritarian politics. But at the same time, does not help us to understand why Russia is becoming stronger as a result of this bad governance. Why Lukashenko is so stable for many, many years. And we need the concepts, the knowledge structures to understand the very, very important processes, which has been probably proven to be much more defining for what is happening in the whole post-Soviet space. And finally, the people who say just goodbye for socialism because those countries, Tajikistan, Estonia, has become so divergent. One is in the EU and almost like a Nordic country. Another one is forgotten Central Asian state. So what's even the whole point to speak about post-Soviet, post-socialist? Is it not even just fundamentally colonial viewpoint when we still stick to the older state, which has not been with us for several decades, but we want to look at the supposed commonalities. But at the same time, despite all the divergences, there are also convergences, and which are actually connected to the fact of the states being emerging from the process of the state socialist disintegration. So convergences of Russia, Georgia, convergences of Russia and Hungary, and other so-called illiberal governments in the Central Eastern Europe, which actually react to the process of neoliberal globalization in a way which is pretty similar to the way how the post-Soviet authoritarian governments have been reacting to. So that's the point, that many people have been working on the research programs which at this point may be not working as much as they would have been hoping for. And they start to systematically miss very important processes which actually define the fundamental events and processes which are unfolded right now. And this creates this process, this effect that we do not even understand what is going on next. So, this is an outline of, what was the hope for an alternative research program, which would actually center the concept of crisis and responses to the crisis at the very core of the research agenda. And this is developed in our co-authored paper with the Russian sociologist Oleg Zhuravlev. The Gramscian theory is at the center of this paper, and what we might call suspense that we still do not understand, we still do not know what has come after the state socialist collapse is a part of the explanation. What has been happening is a continuous crisis when nothing stable has emerged. But there's been also the important responses to this crisis. So the crisis is not an event. It's not just something that what Trump is going to do next week. But it's actually a long-term process with its own dynamics of reproduction and development. It's a downward spiral of disintegration of the crisis. And the post-Soviet crisis, which started even before the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, but had roots in the late 1970s. This is an essential part, but also a cause of the global crisis of democratic capitalism. It has contributed to the crisis which is now unfolding on the global scale. And at the same time, it was also influenced by it. It also defined why nothing stable has emerged in our part of the world, or at least until recently. It's fundamentally a global and materialist theoretical framework. It argues against methodological nationalism when we try to explain what is happening in our country only or primarily by the processes which are happening in our country. It's against provincialism and exceptionalism, and we just focused on what is happening in the post-Soviet space as something that's truly exceptional, but not actually connected to the fundamental processes which define the whole world. And the concepts of the interconnected and mutually amplifying crisis of hegemony and of the revolution are fundamental concepts to understand this. How the ruling class is trying to organize a stable rule, and at the same time how the subaltern classes, the working class, is trying to organize an alternative way of the social integration. That's something that is supposed to follow after the successful revolution. A stable order in the interests of the subalterns. And revolutions are happening, they're happening at the escalating scale, but they do not lead to that order. And that is a problem of the crisis of the revolution. So, a bit of maybe more abstract things, but actually, if you followed yesterday's events and the viral talk by Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, which he made just yesterday at the Davos Forum, and where he plainly said that the rules-based order was partially a lie, because it was always the order in the interests of the United States, and we all understood that they use this order, they use this rule for very selectively in their own interests, but at the same time it was only partially a lie. It was also partially truth, because there was indeed some there was indeed some element, maybe an important element of pursuing common interests, because many states actually benefited from that order. They benefited in terms of the security, in terms of certain international institutions, and so on and so forth. So there was partially truth, partially lie, partially specific interests of the United States, but also partially the common interests of all the states that were integrated into that order. And that's the whole point about hegemony. When in more like class perspective, more like directly connected to what Gramsci and other Marxists were writing about, how the ruling class is capable to organize the society and in such a way that it actually works in the interests of the ruling class, but at the same time, this also becomes the universal interest. The ruling class is becoming more and more politically developed to the point that it actually can integrate the other classes into the stable political system. And so the Western European bourgeoisie in the 19th century, Gramsci's case is primarily France, they were developing institutions of hegemony, citizenship, parliamentarianism, the rules of law, and so on and so forth, which actually created the fundamental of the pursuance of the common interest in the politics. And at the same time, why they were doing this, because, well, the masses of workers were coming to the rising and growing cities. They were needed for the industrializations, for the factories. And to control them politically, there was a need for new political structures. It was not an agrarian society. It was not a peasant society of like dispersed villages. The dangerous classes have become concentrated in the cities. So there was a need of the political integration. Otherwise, there was a threat of a social revolution. The social revolution actually threatened the ruling classes with mass expropriation of their property, liquidating them as classes, like to put it in a Bolshevik way. And in response to that, the ruling class is integrating the subaltern classes. But at the same time, the growth of the bourgeois hegemony also creates the conditions and opportunities for the counter-hegemony of the working class. From the small groups, circles, mutual help societies, to the unions, to the press, to the social democratic parties, to the communist parties, and ultimately, well, on the international level, to the Soviet Union at the peak of its development after the Second World War, when the Soviet Union could actually claim, and it actually received a lot of, well, genuine support as the counter-hegemonic pole for the whole world. Like truly and claiming, and at the same time also receiving, and that claim was not simply a lie, partially truth, by the millions of people organized in the communist movement in many, many parts of the world. That was a counter-hegemonic pole, but at the same time it also contributed to the development of the bourgeois hegemony to the highest point, organized into the democratic capitalism, which also emerged after the Second World War and organized by the United States. And so that was a virtuous circle of hegemonic and counter-hegemonic development. And the dynamics of social revolution and counter-revolution were crucial here. So hegemony enables a stable class rule in spite of and as a result of the intensifying threat of the antagonistic class. So what happens next? Hegemony crisis could be understood as the reverse development, as the fragmentation, disarticulation, disorganization of the political dimension of the bourgeoisie and the working class. They're becoming less and less integrated, fragmented, first of all, among themselves. In Gramsci writings, there is an example of the Europe after the First World War, characterized by the unstable governments and coalitions, multiplication, fragmentation of political parties, intensified zero-sum struggle within the elites, escalating scandals, corruption charges, and so on and so forth, which actually sounds a lot like what is happening right now, but maybe even on a bigger scale. That crisis after the First World War received different responses, different solutions. One was what Gramsci also called Caesarism, which in the form of fascism, in the form of the fascist counter-revolution, actually was a way to exploit the crisis and to establish a counter-revolutionary rule to suppress the dangerous working classes at that moment. But when the fascism was defeated, there was something like an organic solution. A re-establishment of hegemony, re-establishment in the form of the democratic capitalism, in a coalition, in alliance, in cooperation with the counter-hegemonic force of the communist movement and of the Soviet Union. Then this arrangement, institutionalized during the Cold War and working for about 30 years, is entering into a crisis. And there is a lot of discussions how exactly it is happening, and I would point to the role of the Soviet Revolution degeneration. And what follows next is the less and less democratic governments, the proliferation of the technocracy, of authoritarian tendencies, that we are seeing at the highest development by this moment right now, when, well, one state is capable, well, to claim that Greenland is ours, and, well, Venezuelan leader can be simply kidnapped and for certain political reasons. But also the responses to this fragmentation of the ruling class and intensifying authoritarian destabilizing tendencies are also very weak. They are actually massive. Massive populist movements, anti-establishment parties, Syriza, Corbyn, Mélenchon in France, well, in Germany, the right-wing AfD, but also Sarah Wagenknecht and so on and so forth. But those responses are actually poorly organized. They poorly articulate the interests of the working classes. They actually they do not contribute to the unity of the working class. They actually contribute to the fragmentation. And so there is this vicious circle of the downward spiral when the fragmentation of the ruling class is interconnected with the fragmentation of the supposedly revolutionary, supposedly democratic responses from below. The crises from below, from above, are amplifying each other. And we have this accumulation of what Gramsci would call conjunctural political crises that actually do not lead to organic solutions. They lead to, well, to catastrophic developments. And so, well, in this analysis, well, at least, maybe if not the primary cause, but I would actually say that it's primary, but anyway, it's fundamentally important. The degeneration of the revolution in the Soviet Union, which produces the crisis of the extraordinary depths. And it is of the extraordinary depths precisely because the post-Soviet hegemony crisis is in its origins the crisis of counter-hegemony, the crisis of the organization of the working class, which was actually provided by the Communist Party and its vast hegemonic apparatus, which kind of penetrated the whole of the society. And then it was centrifugally disintegrated. And at the same time, it also contributed to further neoliberal erosion of the bourgeois hegemony of democratic capitalism. And at the same time, what happened aftermath was only the promise of a very narrow integration for the post-Soviet countries, which would benefit just narrow groups of the quite privileged social groups in the society, primarily the professional middle class, certain comprador elites, and so on and so forth. It didn't work as a way of hegemonic integration. And the extraordinary depths of the hegemony crisis in the post-Soviet countries produces quite exceptional responses. So this question about the post-Soviet Caesarism, which is fundamentally a way to look at the post-Soviet authoritarian regimes in their connection to the class interests and to the developing social structure of our society. Because the authoritarian regimes in the post-Soviet countries are not simply working not simply in the interests of the narrow groups of elites. They do actually serve a certain social function, both for the ruling classes and also for large groups within the society. And that explains their potential for stability and also potential for the consolidation. This points to the type of capitalists which acquired the dominant positions in the post-Soviet society and the economy, political capitalists whose major competitive advantage are the selective benefits from the state, not the technological innovation like Elon Musk, not the super exploitation of labor force. In fact, the post-Soviet labor was better rewarded than in in the global south. But actually, the selective benefits that they were receiving through the informal connections to the officials, to the way they could use the loopholes in the laws, the way they could use the different institutions to move to expropriate the rent and then move it to the offshores and so on and so forth. Fundamentally, this is a predatory model. You just steal from the state in very rough terms, and then you move this capital to the offshore abroad. And you do not invest locally because you do not have the hope. You are not certain that the next political leader would be to the same way beneficial to you as it was under the current president. But the authoritarian regimes, which could be called Caesarist in this definition, they provide certain point of stability. They organize the long-term interests of the political capitalists, which is in the preservation of a sovereign state via balancing and coercion. But also at the same time, they could provide a way of, well, a form of stability for large sections of the electorally important subaltern classes, which do provide the necessary electoral support for the Caesarist rulers. This structure is not sufficiently stable. It is fragile. There are points of vulnerabilities. So the way of, well, there's this prebendalism, which is a Weberian term, which also used by Russian political scientists and also Hungarians, Szeleny Mihály, Vladimir Gelman. Authoritarian leaders may enrich elites with property and offices, but all those enrichment remains highly insecure, and it is subject to repeated loyalty tests. And in fact, the test of the Russian invasion worked as in the same way. So those Russian oligarchs, which were basically they needed to make a choice. Either they stay with Putin or they try to move. And actually, they didn't have so much of the opportunities to do that. But as a portion of the Russian elite, which actually bet on the transnational connections and had more, roughly speaking, outside of Russia than within, they could, for example, abandon the Russian passports and basically stop being Russians. But it didn't work for the majority of the Russian oligarchs. So that's a loyalty test. And of course, it does produce the grievances, it produces the potentially dissenting elites. Those elites may join at the certain vulnerable points, especially during elections, the protesters. And in the countries like Ukraine, which experienced 3 revolutions in the life of just 1 generation, or in Armenia, or in Georgia, or in other countries, it actually can lead to the change of the government by the revolutionary mobilization. In response, this leads to ever more coercive responses. So the consolidation of the Russian regime should be understood actually in connection with what has been happening in Ukraine, with the failed revolution in Belarus in 2022, with what has been happening in Georgia, Armenia, in Central Asian countries. Right on the eve of the Russian invasion in January 2022, there was a massive uprising in Kazakhstan, where Russia actually also at least showed their symbolic support to a certain fraction of the Kazakh elite around the current president Tokayev. And that was important. But in that perspective, you should also look at the rising and intensifying uprisings on the periphery of Russia, which has been actually preceding the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Within Russia itself, we could look at the 2012, the so-called protests for the fair elections, which have been preempted, and their their development into the truly revolutionary mobilization was prevented by the conservative turn of the Putin's regime by that moment. So in this perspective, we could actually look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine as an extension of the Caesarist coercion across the borders, imposing the long-term interests of the specific fraction of the ruling class, of the political capitalists, in a way of not simply domestic repression, but of the military coercion across the borders, and asserting the sovereignty of the Russian state at the same time. Then it's also the question of how the Russian regime itself is changing during the war, whether it's becomes kind of like a more of the stronger and more authoritarian Caesarism, or it's actually transforming into something else, into more mobilizing, into more ideological kind of regime. And from the global perspective, we could look at post-Soviet authoritarianism, especially in the form of Putin's regime, as a part of, and maybe even a vanguard of the global authoritarian trend. And that's also the point of change in the perspective, where the Putin is not simply, another bad government, which simply takes rent and uses it for the very, very particular interests, like building palaces and so on and so forth. It actually manifests certain political structure which serves fundamental interests in the changing world at least in a more efficient and more stable way than the other forms of the political regimes which are entering into deeper and deeper crisis. And then responses from below. People do not like, the escalating repression. They want representation in the government. They actually want to have better lives. They protest against the neoliberal, technocratic, authoritarian governments. There's quite robust statistics behind the claim that the number of destabilizing episodes, and specifically revolutionary episodes, when the mass mobilizations actually lead to the change of government or threaten the change of government, they have been rising. There is a big discussion in the studies of the revolutions and of the protest movements. Mark Basinger and Vincent Bevin's books are the most important if you would be interested to look deeper. But the problem is that at the same time, when the typical characteristics of the contemporary revolutions are actually, or should be, at least according to certain theoretical expectations, they should be conducive for liberal democracy because they are unarmed, quite often non-violent. They are based on broad and diverse protest mobilization in urban spaces. They lack social radicalism, so they do not present that of the existential threat. Their outcomes are not of the liberal democratic nature. They do not contribute to the expansion of democracy. There is a big difference between social revolutions and contemporary revolutions. And here I base on the Mark Basinger's very robust quantitative analysis of the outcomes of the different kinds of revolutions. Social revolutions, which actually threaten the dominant class structures. As an outcome, they did increase state capacity, they improved on corruption, they improved on the crime rates, they did increase social equality, despite all of the conservative criticism against them. They did improve on ethnic tensions. At the same time, they typically built durable authoritarian regimes. The Soviet Union, China, Iran itself, and it's actually part of the explanation why even under very significant pressure of the protesters and the international pressure, Iranian regime is capable to withstand it. even with the direct military attacks by Israel and by the United States. But contemporary revolutions, they do not lead to durable democratization. They hardly build any stable political order at all. They decrease state capacity, they fail to curb crime rates, they undermine prospects of economic growth, they increase income inequality, they exacerbate ethnic tensions. At the same time, well, at least specifically non-violent revolutions are also more vulnerable to the counter-revolutions, from both domestically but also internationally, to keep in mind Ukraine. And what is the most palpable achievement of the contemporary revolutions is the abrupt and substantial increase in expressive political liberties. But the question is, who is better predisposed to benefit from this opening space for political action? Different social groups are capable in a different way to use them. And why it doesn't happen? Why the contemporary revolutions produce destabilization rather than the stable democratic responses to the crisis? So some people would say that they are simply not revolutions. They are coup d'etats, they are regime breakdowns. In this way, they claim that the revolutionary form of change in power is irrelevant. It doesn't matter whether we change the government by the military coup or by the mass mobilization of the people. And this is problematic. Much more popular response, at least in the academia, not speaking about the public discussion, is that the contemporary revolutions changed. Their process have changed. So, for example, they shifted to unarmed contention. And some people, actually, that would be quite a mainstream argument in the studies of the revolution. They redefine the revolutionary concept. So it becomes explicitly agnostic regarding the revolutionary outcomes. So the revolution is simply an irregular change of the government by the means of mass mobilization. That's it. We do not expect, or at least, in our research, we do not expect any specific outcomes of that. And then we can analyze how different social conditions, for example, the GDP level, the urbanization level, education level, may have an influence on the outcomes of the revolutionary changes of power. Or we can also build another models that would try to analyze how, for example, the different processes within the revolution, for example, non-violence, contribute to specific outcomes. But the problem is that in this kind of analysis, and again, speaking about very systematic push of the research program, they tend to assign democratizing effects to revolutionary mobilization. So the people are united, they come to the streets, they organize, in a civil society, it's self-empowerment and democratic participation, and so on and so forth. That is supposed to have democratizing effects. But when it actually doesn't happen, it doesn't lead to stable democracies. How they explain it? By the exogenous factors, by something that is external to the revolution itself. So, for example, the power of authoritarian states is preventing the revolutions to build stable democracies. Or the deviations from the non-violent resistance produce the unwanted outcomes. Basically, this is a way to introduce liberal teleology. So, given sufficient time, this revolutionary mobilization, the civil society structures emerging in contemporary revolutions might yet evolve into consolidated democracies. This is, an argument that has a very specific, very clear ideological and also teleological dimension. You just need to wait more. But when it systematically does not happen, it's also the point to starting asking questions. Maybe it's not even supposed to happen. The revolutionary mobilization in the current times does not work like this at all. And here, our argument about what is happening that is neither the end of revolutions nor the evolution of revolutions. It's the crisis of revolution. So we should not neither disregard the revolutionary form of change in power, nor, well, kind of like make it too positive. The problem is, well, when the people do not problematize the revolutionary form at all. It should be problematized because the revolutionary form of change in power has both democratizing but also destabilizing and authoritarian effects. And under certain conditions, the destabilization and authoritarianism would gain more opportunities to develop. And this condition is the combination with the counter-hegemonic weakness, with the fragmentation, disunity, disarticulation, disorganization of the subaltern classes, which creates the process of the reproduction and escalation of the fundamental hegemony crisis. And when we do not have hegemony, we do not have a stable liberal democracy. So here the concept of the deficient revolutions, which are not unsuccessful, they are not failed, they are not abortive. We should treat the destabilizing outcomes of these revolutions as typical, not anomalous. This is what they usually lead to, and this should be, well, accepted as a norm, not as some deviation of a supposed liberal democratic pattern. Why they are deficient? Because they combine this revolutionary form, asserting the sovereign will of the people against the incumbent government by the means of mass mobilization. This revolutionary form is in the fundamental abstract form, is reproducing since the French Revolution of the 1789. But at the same, and this revolutionary form matters. When people come to the streets and they demand that they are the people and they are the source of power against the government, this inflates their expectations. They actually expect something fundamental to change after the revolution. It also introduced polarization, because always this claim of the people is not inclusive of everyone. And there will always be the people who are not included into the people. This is the point of polarization created by the revolution. And also, it produces asymmetrical political amplification. Certain groups are more predisposed to use the opening opportunities of the revolution. And then it becomes to matter significantly which kind of groups are beneficial, the beneficiaries. And the element of the deficient revolution concept is the counter-hegemonic weakness, which empirically manifests in the loosely structured and amorphous revolutionary coalitions, in the vague demands beyond the call to remove incumbent governments, in the absence of strong cohesive leadership. These are the features which are actually manifested sometimes in a less astute form, but they are present in the contemporary populist mobilizations in the countries with more like stable, coherent regimes. They are present in the even not in a protest politics, but in the way how the new parties are organized, much looser than the traditional, the legacy parties of the 20th century. And this counter-hegemonic weakness is also manifested in the contemporary revolutionary process. So how the deficient revolutions reproduce and escalate the crisis? They are a key mechanism in the development of the crisis. They respond to the crisis of hegemony, however, they also reproduce and even intensify the very crisis. So all of the revolutions polarize, but deficient revolutions, they polarize not along the class lines, but across the classes. They introduce even more of the disintegration of the classes. All of the revolutions, they produce asymmetrical political amplification. But under the conditions of the disorganized subaltern classes, they create opportunities for more privileged, or at least better organized groups. And these privileged groups, or better organized groups, they do not necessarily represent the inflated expectations of the majority of the society or even the majority of the participants in the revolutions. But they acquire bigger opportunities to pursue their agendas and interests which are not representative. So as a result, the deficient revolution is intensifying the very crisis. And how much time is actually?
10 minutes?
Yeah, that's enough. So, coming to Euromaidan and to give some of the empirical illustration to what I'm talking about. There are quite known main narratives about Euromaidan, which actually reproduce the typical discussions about the contemporary revolutions about which I was talking about, but at the same time they also reproduce the main research programs about post-Soviet transformations. So one is, which is, not so much accepted among the, academic community, but actually by quite many people accept it. But has much bigger prominence in the public discussions about the Euromaidan, that it was like a far-right oligarchic US-driven coup d'etat. And in this way, the argument basically discounts the massive participation and the revolutionary form of what was happening. According to the survey, something like between 15 and 20% of the Ukrainian population claimed that they participated at least in some form in that event. And during the Euromaidan itself, between 40 and 50% of Ukrainians said that they do support the protest action. So that was there was sufficient evidence of really massive participation, and it did matter. The alternative narrative is about nation-building revolution, which is fundamentally teleological and methodologically and also politically nationalist narrative, where Euromaidan becomes a kind of like culmination point of the a long process of Ukrainian nation building, starting from, resistance against Russian Tsars under the Russian Empire, then to the revolution during the collapse of the Russian Empire in 1917, and there was specific development in Ukraine, which should not be reduced to the Russian Revolution, then to the Ukrainian dissidents resisting the communist regime, then to the Ukrainian independence and the first 1990 revolution on Ukraine, then 2004 Orange Revolution, then finally Euromaidan. And then even bigger culmination point, the mobilization of Ukrainians in defense against the Russian invasion in 2022. And there are books which are basically written in this way and telling the story. Or another narrative is about basically something like reproducing the status quo of oligarchic pluralism. Fundamentally, nothing changed as a result of revolution itself. And anything that has been consequential, it's something like exogenous. It's external to the revolution. It's an outcome of the Putin's annexation of Crimea, or the starting the war in Donbass, or the full-scale Russian invasion. And at the same time, as you can connect, it also reflects the typical narratives about post-Soviet transformations. So in my analysis, which starts from the 2014 and builds on the even earlier collection of the studying of the protest events in Ukraine, and that's a book which basically integrates a number of more like polemical essays that I've been writing for 10 years, but also a number of research papers published on different aspects of the Euromaidan, about the far right, about the violence, about the exclusionary nationalism which has been emerging in the Euromaidan, and how it all contributed to the asymmetrical amplification of different political and class forces after the Euromaidan revolution and before the full-scale invasion, and how it's connected to the class asymmetries in Ukraine. So that builds the basis of this argument about Euromaidan as a deficient revolution. So Euromaidan responded to the crisis of hegemony. It was a response to the Caesarist coercion from within and from without to the decision of the Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych to abandon the process of the European Association Agreement, which was perceived by the, at least by the Euromaidan supporters, as illegitimate and corrupt, and also as a result of the Russian pressure. So that's kind of like the response to this crisis of hegemony, the response to the incapacity to present the decision not to integrate into the EU, but, for example, develop the integration with Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan in the Eurasian Union, for which there have been actually quite strong arguments that it could be beneficial for the most advanced parts of the Ukrainian industry. But that decision lacked legitimacy. It was perceived as corrupt. It was perceived as externally imposed. So that's a very different question about the objective consequences of what could have been as a result of the rather Eurasian integration, not the European integration. Response is the massive mobilization, but this mobilization reproduces the weak counter-hegemony of the post-Soviet society, extremely weak organization of the social groups, of the workers primarily. So the different people who participated in the Euromaidan, workers, women, students, so on and so forth, from different regions. But they were not organized in the groups that would claim the representation and the pursuance of their corporate interests. Different people who were only superficially united by the, what we called with Zhuravlev, eventful civic nationalism, when they basically perceive themselves as united Ukraine which came to the streets, but at the same time the unity of that common interest of all Ukrainians have not been properly articulated. That was simply the unity of the presence in the protest event, nothing more. But at the same time it also excluded a very big part of Ukrainians, a half of the society, who did not support and who did not participate in the protests. They stopped being a part of Ukraine itself because of not participating in the Euromaidan event. The escalation of the counter-hegemony crisis, actually the incapacity of political strike, which goes directly to the weakness of the workers' organizations, was a direct factor of the violent radicalization, because the protesters could not remove the government by the non-violent actions. The primarily radical nationalist groups used the strategic deadlock to push forward the way of violent removal of the government. The result was even further ethnicized polarization. Violence also contributes a lot to the polarization of the society. And the asymmetrical amplification of the radical nationalists themselves, who became very prominent in the protests. And there's been a very, very long discussion about how they are, well, supposedly marginal. Not so many people vote for the far-right parties in Ukraine. But they have been becoming more and more important and significant in the street politics. And the result of what is happening right now is that actually some of those leaders of the Ukrainian far right, for example, Andrei Beletsky, now the commander of the 3rd Army Corps, now he actually has the high trust by the very big part of Ukrainians, according to the recent survey, something like 40% of trust in the Ukrainian society right now. But the path to this political prominence started on the streets of Euromaidan, where the violence created opportunities for radical groups to become much more visible and prominent in the politics. Also, the comprador middle-class civil society, supported by the Western donors, is very specific neoliberal agendas, actually not supported by usually not supported by the majority of the society, specifically the public health reforms, the education reforms that they were pushing, and they have acquired more opportunities to push them forward in the political agenda. They were further contributing to the crisis of the post-Euromaidan government. And the result was also further political fragmentation of the working class and the repression of the left in the form of the decommunization and repression of other political forces. The crisis of counter-hegemony contributes to the intensifying crisis of hegemony of the post-Euromaidan governments. So we have inflated expectations, but at the same time, the space of action for Poroshenko and later for Zelensky is actually restricted by the power of the radical nationalists, by the power of the, well, NGOs, civil society, who present themselves as civil society typically, but actually not representing the interests of the majority, by the dependence on the Western governments. And, well, Zelensky himself could be seen, well, he was elected in a vote which manifested very brightly the crisis of representation as the vote against the old elites, the vote not even for, but against Poroshenko as representative of the oligarchs. But at the same time, the vote for someone who was basically nobody in politics. And he acquires the parliamentarian majority in 2019. But that majority is quite fragile. It started to fragment already the next year. The ratings of both the servants of the People Party and Zelensky starting to go down. And Zelensky is kind of like getting into the position of a weak Caesarist leader, not as a democratic leader, but yeah, but as someone who is trying but cannot establish a more robust, stable government. And well, these destabilization tendencies are pushed forward by the Euromaidan developments. They directly contribute to the destabilization which has been used by Putin in launching the full-scale invasion. Actually, the perception of Ukraine as vulnerable was not simply kind of like determined by the ideology. It has been a development of political processes. And then this is a scale up of the political crisis, these global repercussions, and then it becomes a question of whether the deficient revolution can defend itself. Unlike the social revolutions, which were actually capable to build stronger states, and quite often they've been capable to defeat a much stronger enemy in a long, atrocious war. This is not happening in Ukraine right now. Something else is happening, and this is connected to the development of the crisis. So, getting to the conclusions, I think the outcome of the war may indeed challenge the main paradigms about the post-Soviet transition and, in fact, post-1999 period globally. This is kind of like an outline of a distinct research program focused on the dynamics of the hegemony and counter-hegemony crisis, the vicious circle, unwinding downward spiral of deficient, conservative, and revolutionary solutions. Deficient revolutions are not just morbid symptoms, but actually a key mechanism in the crisis, in the development of the crisis. They respond to, but also facilitate the global authoritarian trend. The current crisis is also, maybe even in the first place, is a crisis of revolution, is a crisis of our capacity to organize a better society. And also, obviously, it points to the question whether hegemony and social revolution have a future at all in the coming world, and whether we will have a future unless we will find certain solution to that. Thank you, and sorry for maybe talking for a bit too much.
Okay, we have almost 20 minutes for discussion. Amina, please.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your input. Maybe I'm sorry in advance if I couldn't understand that from your input, but I still have to ask two questions. The first one is, what do you think is the relationship between Caesarism and like generally existing patrimonialism or neo-patrimonialism in the post-Soviet region, and why is there a need to differentiate that, or why are you differentiating that? And the second question is, were the post-Soviet countries destined to be Caesaristic because of the centralization of power to the party and to the general secretary during the Soviet times, and whether do you see a historical continuation in that?
Yeah, great question, thank you. Are we collecting?
Maybe we collect, but maybe this already are too important.
Okay, then I'll try to answer. Yes, I think we need a different concept, not just patrimonialism, because the problem with patrimonialism that it doesn't help to understand the stability. How we can understand, for example, the capacity of Russia to actually withstand in this war where Ukraine is supported by, well, until recently, the strongest military bloc in human history. And does patrimonialism as the kind of like a very pre-modern, in fact, structure would help us to understand the capacity for mobilization, the state consolidation, the elite consolidation, the society consolidation. So it's just insufficient. It doesn't say. The point is, it's not that, well, there is no patrimonialism in Russia, but that it is really insufficient. And the concept of Caesarism is directly connecting to the interests of the ruling classes and the interests of the large sections in the society. The organization by the authoritarian government of the long-term interests of the ruling class, and at the same time providing certain benefits for large parts of the Russian society. Which kind of like, at least until this moment, worked in Russia. And whether the post-Soviet countries are kind of like predestined to be authoritarian, I mean, at this moment, I think actually not. But at this moment, we need to think whether we are not getting something like a global Caesarism, this development of Trump's presidency, right? And well, the United States have a very different tradition and very different, let's say, path dependency. Actually, they claim to be themselves as like the beacon of democracy, organizing the democracy for the whole world. But at the same time, we have also seen how that democracy has proven to be very fragile. And it actually would be difficult to claim that it has something to do with Communist Party secretaries.
Just a short comment and then I'm done. But do you still feel like or think there's a certain correlation between maybe also an intergenerational perspective on how the state was perceived during the Soviet times, and it kind of translated into the current situation where there's like this existing, neo-patrimonial structures. I mean, that was more like the question, do you see a correlation between how it was during the Soviet times and how it kind of translated through the maybe intergenerational knowledge or something to the... Yeah. It's
rather not correlation, but continuity. But at the same time, you also need to remember that the Soviet state was also perceived very differently. In the late Soviet times, and let's say in the early Soviet times, during the Bolshevik Revolution, during Stalinism, to be elements of patrimonialism, but also the certain counter tendencies, also pretty repressive tendencies against the development of the deficient patrimonial fragmentation, which indeed started more or less after Stalin's death, and then developed quite significantly during Brezhnev time and so on. And there is a continuity, but also again, there's something insufficient in that explanation, because it does not explain the let's say successes, let's say stability, let's say consolidation of what is happening in Russia right now.
Yeah, I'm still also puzzled about this term Caesarism, what this term really expresses. Coming from Max Weber, then you have more the dominance of the state. The difference between patrimonialism and Caesarism. And you mentioned economic interest when you talked about the Russian invasion in Ukraine, that there are economic interests. To some extent, yeah, maybe. But do we need, first, maybe you say a bit more about how you understand Caesarism exactly. And of course, if you look at Trump, yeah, there is an alliance between certain economic fractions and Trump. That's pretty obvious, yeah. But if I try to apply a class analysis on Russia, I don't see that the whole, yeah, what is actually the political class in Russia is also complicated. But even those who belong to the state oligarchy, like the Rosneft boss, for example, or Gazprom, it was not in this war was not in their interest. They had to be compensated for this, and they suffer on to some extent on this. At least those fractions who have this stronger transnational relation. So if you look, others profit from it. Yeah. So what I also think is my second point. If you really make a class analysis so strong as an explanation for the development we see, and you mentioned also that fractionalization of classes also from the so-called bourgeoisie or capitalist class, then we should take it serious with a real analysis of what kind of class interests play here a role. Otherwise, with Caesarism, it sounds like that you just formulate this return of empires in a different way. Yeah. Yeah. So okay. Yeah.
I think I'm not enough.
You are not enough. Maybe not.
Yeah. So following the same line, what is the relationship of Caesarism to Marx's concept of Bonapartism and the relationship then to August Thalheimer's concept of neo-Bonapartism, which was basically a theory of fascism, which preconditions some equilibrium of classes, so equilibrium between the dominant and the subjugate class. So what is the relationship here? And the second question, I forgot it. Maybe I will remember.
We can make another one? Or do a second round? So you want
maybe I remember.
Okay.
Sorry.
Is it related? Then we continue.
And what do you think about the expressiveness of Horkheimer's racket theory here? Because I think Franz Neumann has analyzed a similar process for the Weimar Republic, where the lack of social corporatism among the political groups gave way to these different economic and political rackets, which were fighting for the state, and in which regard we can this transfer then to post-Soviet states like Ukraine or Russia.
Is it enough? Or do you...
I didn't get the last questions.
The racket theory, the rackets of Horkheimer and Franz Neumann.
Then you have to say what you mean with that.
Okay.
Basically like gangs which are defined by common political or economic interests, which behave in a vacuum of social corporatism and which are fighting for each other for the power over the state. And I think, Karl Stögel already said that it could be useful for analyzing the current situation in Russia and other post-Soviet regimes, right, because of this lack of social corporatism, which you perceive in the counter-hegemonic movement, so to say.
I mean, the gangs, right, that use the conditions of atomization and fragmentation. Right. I mean, yes, it kind of like it points to a certain situation of the 1990s, but something more has been developing from that. And well, here we get to the concept of Caesarism or Bonapartism, exactly, that might be actually very useful. Both Caesarism and Bonapartism, they point to the autonomous state, the state which is autonomous from the interest of the ruling class. And precisely because of that autonomy from the particular interest of very specific oligarchic clans, fractions of capitalists and so on, the autonomous state is capable to organize the collective interests of the class. But Bonapartism and Caesarism organized them in authoritarian way, partially benefiting some groups, but at the same time repressing other groups, so that they not becoming too too dangerous to descend into opposition and so on. So that's the part of the commonality, right? In Gramsci, there is a very specific use of Caesarism, which is probably a bit different from how Max Weber used it. So for Gramsci, it's a thought force in the situation of the social crisis. When he was writing about the 1920s, 1930s. The communists are on the rise, but at the same time, they're not strong enough to overcome the bourgeoisie in the European states. And in this situation, something like a fascist party, or before that, the personalistic Bonapartist Caesarist leaders could intervene and move the balance of forces into this or that direction. Either contributing to the strengths of the ruling class, and that would be a counter-revolutionary Caesarism, or to the strengths of the working class, and that would be progressive Caesarism. So that's the point when there is a developing crisis within the society, which looms to the catastrophe, and when there is a need for the third force to intervene and to impose certain order from above. That's the, let's say, Gramscian concept of Caesarism. It requires certain development for the post-Soviet condition, where there was actually not so much of this class against the class situation, class against class, but there was actually the symmetrical fragmentation of the classes as a result of this Soviet disintegration. The workers were atomized, but at the same time, the emerging ruling class, the oligarchs, were also in the situation of the fight against each other and had big of the problems of the organizing themselves. In Russia, they've been organized by Putin. We could also see it in Ukraine, when they have never been capable to organize among themselves. Neither, let's say, hegemonically, democratically, although there have been certain developments in that direction by Yulia Tymoshenko, by the end of her prime minister rule in 2009, she actually had a project of something like, let's say, big coalition, when the most important oligarchy groups would be rotating in power. And that would create a stable structure, when sometimes that would be Tymoshenko, then Yanukovych, then back Tymoshenko, then back to Yanukovych, and so on and so forth. Something like a change of Democrats and Republicans in the United States. Two-party structure which would exclude all other groups, but at the same time could be potentially stable. It didn't work. Many people believe because of the Yanukovych greed. Nevertheless, neither Kuchma, nor Yanukovych, nor Poroshenko, nor Zelensky were capable to organize strong, consolidated regimes. And that's where how it contributes to the processes of destabilization. Because they were not capable to neither to impose themselves, but at the same time they did not provide any other, let's say, alternative stable democratic structures that would prevent the processes of destabilization in the country. And that's precisely the point where the, let's say, social function of Caesarism is manifested in. And here I think there is a value in that concept, which is not covered by, let's say, patronal politics concepts or by alternative concepts.
Last round. Okay.
Let's collect questions.
Yeah, sure. Let's.
Thank you for the lecture. There were 2 points that interested me particularly. The first one is, as you said, one key component of this deficient revolution is to rephrase the absence of the working class as an independent political actor. And one other thing that you mentioned, the difference is the emergence of left-wing populist formation that basically decline the role of the working class as a revolutionary subject. And I found interesting that you base your analysis on Gramsci, because they also talk about Gramsci. They base themselves, in my opinion, on a wrong reading of Gramsci, the one of Laclau and Mouffe. And therefore I have two questions related to this topic. Is first of all, what is the reality of such left-wing populist formation in the post-Soviet space? And second question, is there a space existing in this post-Soviet space to talk in Gramscian term, for the modern prince of the working class, I would say the independent political organization of the working class?
Yeah. And then?
Yes, likewise, thank you. And something you spoke about was how Ukrainians who did not openly support Euromaidan kind of became more separate or less part of, I think you said they stopped participating in Ukrainian society. Now I know those political divisions within Ukraine are something that's been exploited leading up to and during the full-scale invasion. And now I wonder what you see as the outlook for political unification, or just the political outlook in Ukraine. How has the full-scale invasion changed Ukrainian political unity, and what might it take to achieve what a deficient revolution didn't?
Okay.
Maybe this.
No one? No. Okay, then you have the word.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. Maybe I'll start from the last ones. It's about exclusion, right? So the people who come to the squares, they believe that they are Ukraine because, well, they represent the different regions of Ukraine, or at least they believe they represent it. And they believe that the whole Ukraine, the whole people, is united against Yanukovych, against the government. The reality is that the half of the country is not supporting them. The first half wins. And they have a changed understanding of what Ukraine has become. So Ukraine for them is Euromaidan Ukraine, are those who supported the revolution. Those who did not, they are literally becoming, let's say, less Ukrainian or not Ukrainian at all. They are out of the definition of the nation. And then it becomes more like escalated and escalated. So you are stopping to be Ukrainian when you, let's say, think that in 2014 there was a civil war in Donbass, because there was a quite considerable participation of the local residents in the escalating warfare, despite all the, well, let's say, interventions, intrusions, incursions by the Russians. Then it becomes kind of like even more like narrowing down of the definition. You are less Ukrainian if you continue to speak in the Russian language. And before, let's say, 2014, this was more like 50-50 distribution of those who prefer to speak in Ukrainian or in Russian at home. Then you become less Ukrainian if you support the, let's say, Moscow elite Orthodox Church. Then you become actually less Ukrainian if you voted for Zelensky, despite the fact that actually 73% of Ukrainians voted for Zelensky. But they were like kind of like lesser Ukrainians, because they didn't understand the interest of the nation, which was appropriated by, let's say, more privileged, more educated, more urbanized, more middle class civil society. So this is dynamics of the exclusion, which intensify, in fact, even more with the full-scale war. So the very typical narrative is, and it's actually based on the multiple public opinion surveys, that Ukrainians have become, again, united by the war, like during Euromaidan, but even at a bigger scale. And in the 2022, you would really get something like 90% of trust in Zelensky, 80% of trust in the different state institutions. The institutions which have been like for years despised, mistrusted, and perceived very negatively, like corrupt prosecutor office, like the corrupt security service organization, and so on and so forth, they got like a huge boost in the service of the like 50, 60, 70% of increase of trust, right? But then the expectations of the Ukraine's victory decline, the mobilization declines, and all those ratings go down. And there should be an understanding of the reality of both, of the temporary boost, but at the same time, eventual decline, which is not simply just about kind of like social psychology, which is supposed to work anywhere and everywhere. It's also the certain social political dynamics where the very massive, but at the same time, short mobilization creates kind of like an illusion of unity, which is not capable to properly institutionalize itself. And then mobilization declines, and we are left with the even bigger fragmentation. That's the argument which is behind that exclusion from the society, which is not exactly like that, but this is exclusion from the nation. The questions about the left populism and the modern prince. In fact, the problem is whether we have anything, any condition for the modern prince anywhere at this moment. And if this argument, which I just presented, is correct, we actually have less and less conditions for that, because our mobilizations, which are populist, typically populist in nature, and we can look at the post-Soviet revolutions as a kind of, let's say, populist revolutions, which share very many important characteristics in the vagueness of their demands, in the very looseness of their organization, in the very weak leadership, with populist mobilizations in other parts of the world, which for certain, because of certain factors, in particular because of the strength of the regime, they just do not develop in the revolutionary way, but might have, right? So, the problem is that we have more and more of these responses, but it's a big question whether they actually do create this dynamics of a virtuous circle, of becoming the stronger, more united, less fragmented, more organized, more, let's say, conscious of our fundamental interests. And it doesn't look like this is happening. Although, of course, I might be wrong, and maybe certain dynamics would show some sort of positive hope. And in fact, in the post-Soviet societies, even that kind of like Melanchthonian or other Western European left populism is extremely marginal. So it doesn't mean that there is no social need for that, but it is typically organized by other forces, and in particular by the Caesarist leaders, who can kind of like connect to the grievances and to the demands which are in other political regimes are taken up by either right-wing or left-wing populist mobilizations. But in the post-Soviet countries, they are organized in a different way. So that would be my response.